we are similar in some ways to drug pushers. We're pushing ideas.
Hello, everyone. Masha Kleiner here, and this is our pilot episode of the Verbatim podcast. And I'm super excited to introduce my co-host and also my today's guest, Jim McMurtry. Hi, Jim.
Wonderful to be with you again, Masha.
Thank you so much. So Jim and I only met, I think, less than a year ago. And in the first meeting with a lot of people that I didn't know, Jim was introduced as a teacher who was fired for telling his students the truth. And from the very first words that when Jim started speaking, I realized that Jim is not just a teacher, but once in a lifetime, if you are very lucky kind of teacher. And don't just take my words for it. I have Jim's book here and you should read it if you haven't, but I would like to read a quote from the back of the book. "You're the best teacher I ever had, and most students in Princess Margaret Secondary would say the same. Every student needs and deserves to have a teacher like you." So I think your students were lucky, and the students who didn't get to have you as a teacher are super unlucky. But what I would like to talk, actually take you back and see what made the man who is the kind of teacher that when the moment came, I don't think you chose to say the truth, but you couldn't have it any other way. So I would like to see how you got there. And also, I think the general theme of this podcast would be how we ended up becoming a society where a teacher gets fired for refusing to lie, which is, I think, a horrible thing that happened to all of us, but I'm getting ahead. So let's rewind a few decades. If I remember correctly, you grew up in Ontario and you had quite a special father and many siblings. So maybe we can talk a little bit about your childhood and how it was like.
Oh, I've had a very, very happy childhood. The thing that probably affected me more than anything else, Masha, was that I was a big reader. And I ended up having, I was supposed to have it only once in a lifetime, mononucleosis, but I have an eating disorder. Now I know it is celiac disease, but it manifests itself repeatedly getting mononucleosis. So I'd spend a lot of time sitting and reading and not doing much else. And I met lots of characters, like in To Kill a Mockingbird, people who were heroic. In Les Miserables and Ivanhoe, I mean, there's so many beautiful stories out there. So I think that's my childhood. I'm like any other child. I grew up full of dreams, and I had parents that encouraged the right values.
So did all your siblings love to read as much as you, or was it something unique to yourself?
I think of the, I'm one of 6 children. I think I'm the one that reads the most and read the most growing up. And, you know, and I think that's just sort of my thing a little bit. But I'm sure my siblings would all tell you, oh, don't listen to him. I read more and I'm smarter or whatever. But it's just, yeah, I was really influenced by a grandmother in particular who lived with us for a number of years. And she would always talk about literary characters. And I really loved my English classes. And not that I was especially good at anything to do with literature. It was just something that really attracted me.
Do you still read a lot? Because I find myself, I used to read quite a lot as a child, but now I'm truly embarrassed and I feel like I don't read a lot enough these days, not just a lot.
Well, yeah, it's hard. It gets harder, and I'm busy with lots of things. But I still absolutely, it's just a passion. And I'm not really interested in so much contemporary. I moved away from newspapers a long time ago. And I love reading, particularly older literature. I just find it so, anyhow, I love the sense as I get older, I have understanding where I am. You know, the fact that we humans carry within us a molecule, an atom that comes from before the Big Bang and hydrogen. I think it's, you know, we're part of something so much larger. So I love reading timeless literature.
Okay, so if we go back to your childhood, did you have any teachers that you still remember that kind of helped shape you, that are memorable?
Well, yeah, I think there was a Mr. Bialystok and Mr. Wright. There are two guys who really stood out as people who they were interested in me. And I realized, of course, after a while, I realized that they were interested in other students as well. So that was certainly something that I think is really important is as a teacher, you need to take an interest in everybody. You need to feel that the person behind the student is the most important thing. It's education really is much more about relationships. Kids don't remember that much none of us remember that much from what we were taught 60 years ago in my case, but we do remember people. But there was an English teacher I had in my last year of high school, and he presented us some great literature. And the book that made the biggest imprint on me was a book called The Inheritors by William Golding. And a few years later, I was reading another book, which is very famous, called Lord of the Flies, the same author. And they had changed a word that people didn't like anymore, the N word, and changed it and put Indians, which is kind of interesting, meaning Indians in North America, replaced one controversial term with another. But at that time I was teaching senior English, and I, along with my classmates, we wrote to Sir William Golding and told him that his book, his very famous novel, had been censored, and he wrote me back. And so it's really, so I know that sounds maybe a lot of people are thinking, who is this lunatic speaking right now? But I think there are lots of people that really believe that some of the people that are most important to us in life are literary characters or movie characters or fictional. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that, because every fictional character really is a person or an amalgam of a person. So yeah, that was the Inheritors is what a powerful tale. And that just and then when I got older, I found myself in a situation where people were taking away my livelihood, and I kind of went with my instincts. What's the right thing to do? And the right thing to do is to, in my particular case, is not to lie to kids just because the whole school system. I posted just yesterday about the area where I've mostly taught as an adult in Surrey, British Columbia, after the announcement came out of 215 graves with dead children, that the district had children and staff wear orange shirts for 9 days, symbolically for 215 hours. And I thought that was really an interesting thing, because I'd already left Surrey, but I wouldn't have been able to do that. And it was bad enough where I was. I was the only teacher not wearing orange in a school that was doing the same thing. Such an incredible display, performance of, I guess what we're supposed to do, repent for how terrible our ancestors were toward Indigenous children, whom, of course, what we had done was school freely, and for 400 years in Canada. So to me, it all is intertwined. You can't read books like To Kill a Mockingbird, which is now banned from Surrey schools. It's almost impossible to read it in all sorts of places. And somebody will say, oh, it's not officially banned, but a teacher to read it has to go through all sorts of approval processes and gets outed as some sort of some radical or whatever for wanting to read To Kill a Mockingbird. But there's some characters in there like Boo Radley and Jem Finch and Tom Robinson, but particularly Atticus Finch. I mean, there's a ton of characters that have their own morality. And so when I was dealing with the fact that I've been out of work for 5 years now, and think from time to time, was I braver than other teachers? Because I still think I'm the only teacher in Canada who's taken a public stand against all the indoctrination, particularly with regard to the falsehoods about history. Was it stupid of me? Everybody else is still working and making money, and here I am at home. I'm at home, and yet I'm nourished by the fact that I think far more important in life than, I know money is important, and I know career and other things are important, but I think what lasts long after, what's going to last long after I pass from this world with my children and grandchildren and former students and anybody else that knows me, was there was a man that, you know, a little bit like Polonius said to Laertes and Hamlet, to above all else, to thine own self be true, that I was true to myself, and I was true to history, and I was true to the dead women and men who taught at the Kamloops Indian Residential School. If they didn't murder children, then I don't think that's what we should be telling kids.
Yeah, I think one day, if we stop this craziness that we are seeing now, you might find yourself in some history books as one of the first people who took a stand and helped us reverse the course. And actually, you mentioned the book that made a great impression on me when I was back in school, Lord of the Flies. And often when we find ourselves, or maybe I'll add a video here from us at UBC or in Kamloops campuses, when we find ourselves in a campus of crazy activists shouting at us, it reminds me a bit of that, because crowds really lose control and lose focus of things and lose their humanity. And it often feels that no one is really a grown up around, because everyone is driven by some hurt feelings and lack of responsibility, which sounds a little bit childish to me. So maybe we should go back and teach that book more to everyone. Jim, we are very undisciplined, and actually I want to take you back to your childhood and talk a little bit about your dad. So he was an attorney general in Ontario, and I believe that he made quite an impact on Canada in general, and also was part of the repatriation of the Constitution. So was he kind of a famous, recognized in the streets kind of person? And how much?
Yeah, he was. He was a guy who had a lot of talents. He was drafted to play professional football, decided not to do it. So he had the allure of an athlete, big guy, a lot bigger than I am. And he did other things. He was Attorney General, Solicitor General. He was Canadian Ambassador to, or High Commissioner, as they called it, to Great Britain. He was the Chief Justice of Ontario, CEO of the Canadian Football League, and had an important role in achieving the patriation of the Constitution in 1981, officially 1982, but in late 1981, there was an impasse, and he, along with Jean Chrétien and Roy Romano, they sat up one night and they came up with a way of getting through and bringing at least 9 of the 10 provinces into the fold. And Quebec never signed, but they didn't need Quebec to sign because they already had 9. And I think the formula is 7 of the 10 provinces representing more than 50% of the population. So anyhow, the Constitution was amended. We now have the Charter and so forth. So there's lots of things that I could tell about my father. He was, most importantly, he was just a really sweet guy. I mean, he was a lovely father. But I challenged him. And I did so carefully because I was just probably, just one of his 6 insolent teenage children. And I said, Dad, and my father at one point wrote the speech, or he said he wrote the speech. I don't know what Mulroney did to change it, for Brian Mulroney, the Canadian Prime Minister, for when he spoke up in the House of Commons and saying why he wasn't going to ever bring back the death penalty in Canada. And I, which hadn't been used for all the way back till 1976, I believe. But Mulroney was the one that made sure that the Conservative Party wasn't going to ever bring it back. And so my dad was part of that. And I said, Dad, here you are having a role in making sure the death penalty doesn't come back. And yet you always said to me if anybody ever killed one of your kids, that if anybody ever killed one of your kids, that you would kill him. And now you're saying you're making sure that the Canadian state never kills anybody. And how do you explain that? And he said, well, because the law should never allow a state to murder its citizens. And okay, that's persuasive. And then he said, but if somebody murdered one of my kids, I'd kill him. But I'm not the state. And it was sort of an interesting thing. So what he did is he gave me moral complexity. It's not, everything is not, this is the thing that goes wrong with our society is these people, all residential schools were terrible. Well, I would be just as upset if people are going around saying residential schools were perfect. You know, just that doesn't exist. And what you want to do is have an intelligent conversation. And with regard to residential schools, since I just brought it up again, is the fact that you can't condemn a system, first of all, without knowing about it. And secondly, you can't assume everybody in a school had the same experience. And that's true in any school. That's true in any institution or anywhere at any time, in any activity. And so I don't know why we moved into a society where in 2022, that every single parliamentarian, every single one of them voted into support of a motion saying that Canada committed genocide through its residential school project. There wasn't a single person that said, whoa, whoa. But this is a pretty bad indictment of ourselves to put us up there with Pol Pot and Hitler and the Hutus in Rwanda, before we put ourselves alongside Stalin and all these horrible Mao in history, we need to talk about this. And so since, of course, there's not evidence of a single murder, of a single, there's just no evidence of genocide whatsoever in Canadian history. So since 1867, and there certainly is evidence before then, but that's only what was intertribal. It had nothing to do with the early Europeans.
And imagine if there weren't for the schools, I'm sure we would name ourselves a genocidal nation for not educating the indigenous population and leaving them behind. So I think there was more interest in blaming ourselves and finding guilt than actual reason here. But let's go back again. I will be disciplined. So your father was a lawyer, but you decided to be a teacher. And I understand that in your studies, you actually studied indigenous, was it education specifically focused on residential schools or more general? I forget. But when did you realize that you want to become a teacher? And like, what was your path to that?
Well, I don't really think I was that conscious about it. I was always good with my younger siblings and kids in the neighborhood, and people would just say to me, "Oh, you'd be a great teacher." I just sort of walked into the profession thinking that's probably what I'd like to do. I just had a really nice time as a student. I loved so many of my teachers and loved the experience. And when toward the end of my last year of high school, I was thinking sometimes about would it be a good idea to fail on my courses if I could do that, so I could have one more year of it. Like I didn't want to leave high school. But I got into a master's program for teachers, thinking that if I was going to do graduate work, do it while I was younger without having children and so forth. And I went to the University of Alberta, and it turns out that the person who was going to be in charge of me was the chairman of the department, named Robert Carney, who was Mark Carney's father. And we hit it off. Anyhow, just a marvelous guy. And I ended up not knowing much about residential schools, but I ended up asking him if I could do that as for my thesis, or what they called Indian education policy, which the schools were a part of. And he was happy to get somebody else, because a lot of professors like it when their graduate students are doing similar work, because then they can feed off some of the research that is created. And so I ended up, I'm sure, reflecting absolutely everything that Robert Carney told me about residential schools and their challenges and their purpose and so forth. At no time was there ever a judgment saying the schools were bad or the schools were good. They just didn't seem relevant. It's like me, I've never evaluated my parents. Tell me about your parents. Are they, at 90% or whatever, what mark would you give your parents? You don't do that. If someone asked me, were your parents good? I would say, well, first of all, why are you asking that? I mean, that's sort of an invasive question, but I love my parents. My parents brought me into this world. Like that just isn't something that you think about. If you're schooling kids who don't have any schooling in the northern and western fringes of Canadian society, where school is the difference between having an education or not having an education, being able to compete in a modern civilization, how can you have an argument as to whether the schools were right or wrong? No more at the height of residential schools was there any more than a third of the kids in them. And then increasingly, they moved kids away from the residential schools. And even in Kamloops, that they said was open until 1978, it didn't have any high school students after 1959. So these schools, they moved quickly. They didn't want to take them away from their parents. They recognized that that's not always the best thing to do. And in some cases, it was necessary because a lot of the kids were orphans or kids that were taken out of homes to avoid the child abuse or the starvation or other ills, incest. I mean, there was just so many problems, drugs, alcohol. There's so many problems in residential schools, particularly in marginalized, isolated communities 100 years ago, that it was salvation, pure salvation for these kids to get away from that.
I think it's ironic that we don't allow ourselves to say anything bad about any other culture, but we are not allowing ourselves to say anything good at all. Like if you say that there was something good about residential schools, even if you even go that much, that's like a horrible thing to say, it turns out, in some circles, right? Sorry, I interrupted.
No, well, Masha, I've always found you so incredibly intelligent. That's another thing. That's part of the woke ideology or the liturgy, the things that you do and you don't do as you're practicing this cult, this religion. And one of them is you don't say anything positive, you said. As a teacher about anybody who's Christian or white or in many cases even male, and but certainly anything to do with Western civilization, the greater scheme, capitalism, all these things that this is, we look around us and all the things that we have right now. How can you impugn Christianity and capitalism and just modern life and English jurisprudence and the literature that we inherited? I mean, going back all to the Greeks, to the Romans. I mean, how can you impugn all that? But that's what you're supposed to do in the school system. And so that's an excellent point. I just want to be someone, and you're allowing me to say this, I want to be someone who's inspired to do good, not to be what people see me as today. Oh, he knocks Indigenous people and Muslim religion and trans people and on and on and on. Oh, I guess I do that. Without intending to, without meaning to do that. The people who lie about residential schools are Indigenous. They don't do a service to the truth. They don't do a service to their own people. They don't do a service to themselves. But that's not what I'm after. I'm after a world that's better for everybody, including Indigenous people. And so I just don't want to play by the rules, Masha. And I know you don't either. You know that when people right after, and maybe you don't want me to go here, allow me to, and you can cut this out, but right after the October 7th massacre, which was very difficult for me, in part, you talked about my father. My father grew up in a Jewish neighborhood in Toronto, as did I, and called Forest Hills. And so it's just hard when you know a lot of people and you know their connections to people who've been killed and so forth. And then a short while afterwards, you see people in the school system, including my union, giving $50,000. They dropped me long ago as a client, even though I paid them money, $2,000 a year for 30 years. They dropped me, but they're willing to find money to send over to Hamas. I mean, the world doesn't make sense. The sexualization of children in schools, which I saw. And the world doesn't make sense. Just today, I'm not supposed to say this, but I'm going to say it anyway. My dad, don't say anything about it. Dad, you and your big mouth. But I'm not going to say who she was or what my grandson's name is. But she said last night that her oldest son, who's 4 from daycare, was singing the Coast Salish anthem. And she said, how do you know the Coast Salish anthem? Not the Canadian anthem, nothing to do with Western civilization, nothing to do with things that are universal and consensual. And every parents go, oh, yeah, no, we understand why they do the national anthem. But he's singing and he's got it memorized. And she said, well, how come you have it memorized? And he said, Mommy, we sing it every day. And because the English took away their land. So every day we sing about how it's their land. That's a 4-year-old in the school system, and not even the school system, in daycare. So thank goodness for people like me and you, Masha. I mean, not because we're so brave or heroic or anything. You're all those things, but I'm just a regular schmuck of a guy who goes in a classroom. And more than anything else, you might find this because I'm so passionate and sound angry at times. The one thing I try and do in a classroom is make kids laugh. I know that, I mean, that's my thing. I try and make kids have fun. And then I can sort of get them to learn French or get them to learn history, whatever it is. And, but my gosh, there's just not other teachers or other people like you. You weren't born in Canada, and yet you do more for Canada than anyone else I know by getting out there and fighting against the people who are wanting to destroy our values.
Well, some people will disagree what our values are, but I agree with you on one thing. In all the conflicts, one of the guiding principles is choose the side with a sense of humor. Because you will notice that, for example, woke completely lacks sense of humor because jokes are offensive. You have to be a little bit offensive, push it a little bit to get funny. And that's forbidden these days. I want to ask you one more question, and actually maybe we will close with this. What do you think is, and it's a very open-ended question, the role of a teacher in the classroom? Because on one hand, yes, we often say that let's go back to core principles, learn literacy and math and like simple things. But on the other hand, we always remember the teachers who taught us something more than that, more about life, deeper things. But on the other hand, these days we have all these teachers who are activists who bring their politics into the classroom, and we don't like that. So do we like the politics that we like in the classroom? Like, how do we define that? And is it the job of a teacher really to share their worldview? On one hand, yes, we want to teach the kids how to think and not what to think, but like how you still share some of your values with the students. So where is the line there?
Well, Alberta brought in a bill that addresses this. And they talked about that students should make up their own minds and they should be presented with varied perspectives. And a teacher isn't there to indoctrinate. And these are things the two of us, of course, have agreed on for a long time. But they never use the word truth. So I found that interesting, and everything that I've seen written about Bill 25. So I would start with that. I think a teacher has to be committed to truth. So if we're talking about residential schools, I think the very first thing, the first duty is to present the truth. Whatever comes after is something that's secondary and tertiary. I mean, you have to provide them with the evidence. And my father, the old judge, he would say, well, I want the facts, and then I'm going to weigh them and get the jury to weigh them. And then we come to the truth. So that's really the role of a teacher, is you say this is, and then sometimes it gets controversial. I'm old enough to remember when the colleagues would say, well, be careful if you're talking about evolution, because this is a school, it's a creationist school. They believed in the biblical story of Adam and Eve, and if you teach something, you might get in trouble as a teacher. So teachers are always at risk of getting in trouble because there's always different narratives and different zeitgeist, whatever. There's always stuff coming in, and whether it's to fund the police or because of George Floyd, or even there were pet rocks. There was a time that kids in schools were all bringing in pet rocks, and stores are selling rocks. I mean, just the crazy things that you see that go through society. There's the satanic panic in the 80s and so forth. Salem, Massachusetts. So it's hard. So sometimes you as a teacher are caught while presenting the facts. The kids go, well, what do you think? Well, so this is, as I said earlier, you can't do it black and white. You can't say teacher can't reveal anything about him or herself, because then that's not real. And I said, what's wrong with it if I'm revealing things about myself and my colleagues are all doing the same? I think that's more authentic. That's what the kids want. They don't want the same, boring wah, the Charlie Brown adult says the same thing. It's like humor. Humor isn't good unless it's fresh, unless you push it a little bit, as you said. So I think good teaching is pushing it a little bit. And Northrop Frye, Canada's leading literary critic, talked about the very idea that we push ideas. We are similar in some ways to drug pushers. We're pushing ideas, and they're capable of expanding and even blowing people's minds. And so I would say that the most important thing is to make sure kids come to their own conclusions. But if a kid is asking me an honest question about something about me, Mr. McMurtry, what do you feel about homosexuality? I'm not going to say, oh, I'm not allowed to tell you. I don't think that's the right thing. I would say, well, first of all, whatever I say is for me to think and believe. And if you copy how I think and behave and so forth, then you'll disappoint me. I say to students, if you become like me, then I failed as a teacher. But I'm going to tell you, you've asked me. And where I'm really strong when it comes to things, homosexuality being an example, is I will point to the law. I said, well, with regard to homosexuality, it's a law in Canada that you can't discriminate against anybody on the basis of how they love. And so I support it, but more than that, so should other people. Because we've come to an understanding as a Western society that it's much better to be more accepting of people. And not everybody, again, loves the same. So I'm strong if it's something of value that I know is consensual. If I'm saying something that's personal, that's not consensual, that parents might go, oh, he said that? Then I'm very, very careful. And I make it very clear, okay, you're asking me what I think about this politician, then here's what I say, the good, the bad, this is what I think. But the whole time I'm going through it, I'm saying to the kid, but people think, our best one is maybe abortion. A lot of people think this about abortion. A lot of people think that about abortion. And maybe there's a lot of gray area as well. So I think that's the important thing. So never, ever as a teacher, indoctrinate, brainwash, never have proselytize, never have kids thinking that you are after their minds. And the one comment that I get often from kids, they go, oh, Mr. McMurtry, you talk about things nobody else would talk about in class. That's why we loved you and whatever. That's why you got in trouble too. But because your class, every time we didn't know what to expect. And it was things that in other classes we weren't allowed to talk. There was no intellectual prison in your classroom. Everything was on the table. We talked about everything. And there are many times other kids would say, oh, we can't talk about that. You can't say that. And I'd be going, that's not your decision. We're making this a free space. And that's our commitment. If you don't like it, then you argue against the person. But don't you think that you have a right to silence anybody else? Because you don't. But it's this idea is, people say to me, Merce, we really never understood where you were. Because you're always playing devil's advocate. You're always challenging us and testing us, but we never really knew anything about you. And I kind of thought, okay, maybe I did succeed.
I'm sure you did. Thank you so much, Jim. I think we will continue it at some point, this conversation where we stopped. But quoting Anton Chekhov, one of my favorite writers, brevity is a sibling of talent. So let's not go for too long, although I'm sure I could talk to you all day long. And to our listeners, I hope you enjoyed our conversation here as much as I did. And please subscribe, share this podcast, like, comment, and we will see you next time with some exciting guests that will join us as well. Thank you so much.